Happy spring, huh? How about this? Woo! I have friends on Faceplant that are talking about how can there possibly be global warming with all of this chaos. Well, that's the point, isn't it? Things get a little weird when the Earth's climate gets knocked out of traditional patterns. Speaking of Faceplant, if you combine YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter into a single company, they could make a product called UTwitFace. Yep. Welcome to Science Sunday. This is part 6 of Dr. Joanne Reed's series on thinking critically. Do not say critical thinking. Let that be your lesson. She made that very clear the first program. There are other interesting goings on. Don't forget that this time slot in May, so the third Sunday of May, is our annual Science Slam. So if you've got a 10 or 15 minute topic of something you'd like to share, let myself and or Mike Winter know. We've had interesting things. We've had across the board, we've had talks about human psychology and sociology. We've had talks about ants and bicycles and gyroscopes, and some of these have been in the Science Slam and some of them have been during other programs. But my larger point is you'd be surprised what all these people are here are interested in. Pretty much everything. So, how do detergents work? Why is using a biodegradable detergent better than using a traditional detergent? Who knows, right? So, if you've got something you're passionate about, curious about, or think that you know something about, let us know and we'll put you on the docket for our Science Slam. The first Sunday in May, Dan, who helped us troubleshoot this light here in the center of the auditorium, Dan will be talking to us about virtual reality. Isn't that correct, Dan?
Yeah, virtual reality, holographics, basically the magic of how illusion works in technology today.
Okay. And then your lovely spouse has an announcement, I believe. I'm sorry, I forget your name. Is it Katie?
Crystal.
Crystal. Okay.
I looked it up. So, at the College of DuPage, they're having a STEM-con on April 28th. Is that next weekend already?
Yeah, I believe it is. No, is that 2 weekends from now?
2 weekends.
Yeah.
2 weekends.
It's free entry.
Yeah, it's free. It's mostly for
High school students.
high school kids. Sorry, coffee has kicked it all the way up. So there's going to be cryogenics with Mr. Freeze.
Nice.
And so I just thought maybe you guys would
Yeah.
know about that.
Good. In case you don't know, all of these events are published on our meetup group. It's the meetup for the Humanists of West Suburban Chicagoland. And many of the talks for Science Sunday and some of our humanist programs are on a YouTube channel also related to the Humanists of West Suburban Chicagoland. We meet on the second Wednesday of every month. And we also have philosophers' lunches on the third Thursday. And we have Just Views on the second Friday. My goodness, there's always something interesting going on, so you're welcome to join us for all of those. Anybody else have any other announcements before we dive into thinking critically again? All right, Dr. Joanne Reed.
What an oaky day. I congratulate us all on getting out here today. Boy, did you get the canoe service from the parking lot? Boy. So I welcome you again. This is the sixth and final part of my series on thinking critically, part 6, involving problem solving and decision making. I remind you of our definition. That is, thinking critically is a mental process, verb, that integrates knowledge, skills, and strategies to promote improved problem solving, which we'll be doing today, rational decision making, which we'll be doing today, and enhanced creativity, and they usurped May from me. If I hadn't been sick for 2 months, I'd have got that in, but I didn't do that. So last month, we sort of concluded the preliminaries in the inductive reasoning, hypothesis testing, and probability. So essentially we've gone from just looking at our senses and seeing how our senses work and don't work, through the development of the logical argument, and into the area of deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and all the problems of hypothesis testing, and why science doesn't answer questions. We come up with great questions, and we try to come up with some decent answers, but they're all probabilistic. Oh, drat. So we never prove anything in science, but we suggest that it's probably more correct than other explanations. So today we're going to be looking at our problem solving, decision making, and probability. Now, when do these come into play? These come into play when all of a sudden you're faced with some kind of a dilemma. That is, you're confronted with something which you must resolve. What do you do? How do you solve a problem? How do you make a decision? So we have some basic definitions. There are really 2 of them that I want to talk about a little bit. The first is the idea of a problem and differentiating it from a decision. A problem has a solution. A decision doesn't. You got to come up with the best of all terrible worlds and figure out which one is gooder. See? Gooder. Now, not most goodest, but gooder. And figure out what you're going to do, understanding that it could fail just as well as any other. So, the other things that you'll see in the literature are things that are called well-defined or poorly defined. I don't like this definition as much. You may have seen this expression this way. I'm just not elated with it because it doesn't tell me what to do. So we asked, which is which? How do you know up front whether it's a problem that is soluble or it's a decision that you sort of have to make based upon probability? And the only answer is you have to work at it. Essentially, treat them all the same. Start out with the best way that you can do things. Now, how do most people solve problems? And that is the problem, isn't it? We see this so often in our political leaders, especially in the recent past, that the whole idea of trying to figure something out is beyond their comprehension. They don't put the time in, they don't put the effort in, they don't put the background into place. They don't engage the frontal lobes. And they're off firing away with great lack of skill. How are we going to approach this? We're going to plan. Oh. Wow, can you imagine that? You're going to think ahead. You're going to look at problem-solving strategies. And you're going to persist. It's really easy to give up. In fact, we're good at it. All human beings are really good at going, never mind, and wandering off as though it didn't make the slightest bit of difference. Assume the dilemma is a problem and that it is soluble. Because your general approach is going to be pretty much the same. Start out by writing it down. I know it sounds tedious and everything else, but most of us wander around with a vague idea of what the problem is. If you write it down, you have to use clear, concise English language. You must put in a noun and a verb and a subject. You've got to put it all together. And sometimes simply writing it down solves the problem. You suddenly know what the problem really is. You're going to test various graphical representations. Yeah, good old paper and pencil. It works. It really does a marvelous job. You're going to test the problem and decision strategies, prepare a decision strategy, resolve dilemmas, because there's going to be a bunch of them, and test the results. Sounds easy, doesn't it? Let's take a look at some of the graphical strategies that you could employ. These include linear representations, tree diagrams, graphs, hierarchical trees, matrices, networks, and flowcharts. A lot of us are familiar with many of these. Some of us are familiar with none of them. A linear relationship. We see these kinds of things all the time. John is taller than Sam and Bill. Sam is not as tall as Bill, but taller than Sally. And Jane is almost as tall as Bill. Rank them in order. Now, you can try doing this in your tiny little brain. And you're going to go running around in circles very quickly. Write it down. Suddenly we've got a really good idea. We've written things down. And we know the order in which they must occur. And it's fairly easy then for us to come up with Sally, just a little person. And John, of course, is the basketball player. And in between we have all the other size people. Straightforward if you write it down. Tree diagrams. Here's a wonderful thing for a tree diagram. It's a suicide prevention center. They know that 2% of the people who phone the hotline will attempt to commit suicide. So this is a real world problem. We really don't like to have people just committing suicide. A psychologist devised a test to help identify those who will commit suicide. She found that 80% of those who attempt suicide will get a positive score on this test. All right, so what's our probability of watching a person do terrible things? Well, we set up our basic tree diagram. Now, we've seen this before. We see there are callers. 2% are suicidal, and 1% are not. So where do we go from there? We look at the fact that we have an 80% test here. If this person is 80%, we got a positive of 1.6%. So we can now say, we found out exactly what's going on here. And we use a simple tree diagram to know exactly what's going on. Otherwise, it becomes more difficult. This is also an interesting problem in human psychology. Very often, we will jump to this point right here, forgetting this point right here. It's 80% of 2%, not 80%. So the order in which we put things helps us figure things out more correctly. Diagrams and graphs. Here's Irving. He's out for his morning run. And he goes charging along, and we see he's 2 miles, and then 3 miles, and then another mile, and 2 more miles, and 3 more miles, and finally 5 miles. Where is he? Well, if I just look at this data here, I'm not sure. If I graph it out, he's back home. He did the loop. Oh, okay. So once again, a very simple method of figuring out the answer to what would have been a problem, and in fact is a nice solution. A matrix. For all of you who know about matrix, like Excel, and Access, and those kinds of things, this is a wonderful tool. It's not just an accounting tool. This is a cool thing. So here we have an example where we have a large number of dogs. They have dog houses, which are different colors, and they eat different kinds of foods. The question we have is, which dog eats Crunchy Blend dog food? Well, we simply set up a matrix. There's our dogs, there's their houses, there's their food. And we look at the clues. Speaking of clues, for all of you who played Clue, this is exactly the same. Pizza lives in a blue doghouse, so we know that this house is blue. Sancho eats Butcher Boy. Okay, so once again, we're just filling in the blanks. The dog in the White House is next to the dog that eats Butcher Boy. Well, we know Lady is next to Sancho. We know White is next. Figure that one out. The dog that eats medium rare steaks is furthest away. This is How many of you feed steak to your dog? I know Darwin does. Now, when I'm over there, Darwin does eat my steak, doesn't he? Yes, he does. He likes me. But normally, no. So, let's take a look. And the dog that lives in the red house eats yummies. Well, we know this isn't the red... Whoops. I just clicked too many. We know that this has to be the red house because of yummies. We have Butcher Boy here, so it can't be red. So this has to be red, so this has to be yummies. Well, what's that? It's the space that nobody else has filled. Just like in Clue, when you said Mr. Mustard in the laboratory with the pipe wrench or whatever. So, once again, a simple matrix made it really easy. Lady eats crunchy bread. Blend, not bread. We have a trucking company out in Lincoln, Nebraska. And it's a very nice little trucking company. It's got one truck. They're just starting. And they have 5 loads that they have to deliver. And they're all over the country. Ew! How do we handle this? Well, we have a network. Now, it's amazing how often a network will solve the problems. This happens, of course, to be the interstate network. There's telephone networks. There's nerve networks in our bodies. And by looking at networks, we find all sorts of easy and interesting ways of doing things. And so, can we draw a very nice map coming out of Lincoln, Nebraska, going to San Francisco, down to Dallas, to Atlanta, to New York, to Chicago, and home? Sure. Now, you're on the road for 2 weeks, that's true. And you don't want to do this in December. In fact, you might not want to do it in April. Flowcharts. Again, for all of us who are familiar with flowcharts, my dad was an automobile mechanic, and he would regularly look things up in the big book. And there'd be a flowchart. Look at this. Look at this problem here. Is there a skill problem? Now, this is one of mine, which I use in our business to analyze problems. Is there a skill problem presented by my particular client company? Go, baby, go. That's it. You can do it. So, if the answer is yes, if there's a skill problem, what is the skill problem? Did the people in the company used to do this? Is this something which is done irregularly, like the Christmas sales? How do we set things up for the Christmas sale? Well, we only do it once a year. Oh, what did we do? Did they do it often? Again, so we see a difference between they don't do it very often and they do it very often. This is a matter of practice. Well, maybe they don't. The employees don't have the ability. Well, you got 2 choices then. If you trained them and you did all those other things and they still aren't doing the job, it's time to get new employees. Now, what's the other side of the equation? If there is not a skill problem, and the problems that continue to exist with the performance, is performance punished? Again, we know businesses where if you do a good job, you will get pounded. If the answer is yes, remove the punishment. What happens if it's a case of do we reward non-performance? Yeah, been there? Again, if it's there, get rid of it. Create positive rewards. Is it a case that performance doesn't matter? You're here, show up. And once again, we create consequences. Are there other obstacles? So we can actually go through a business problem and look at a business, a live operating business, and make decisions about how we're going to look at the problem, how we're going to train or not train employees, how we're going to figure out the problems. And again, as most of you know, business problems generally are here. They're management problems, not labor problems. Okay, What happens if at that point you've done all of this bit and it's not working? Drat. Are there other ways of looking at things? Yes, there are far more sophisticated problems and ways of looking at these problems. And here are just some of them. We'll go through these and take a look. Trial and error. It's tedious, but does it work? Sure. Crossword puzzles. You've got 3 out of 4 letters. So what do? A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Ah! You put in the letter I. You can go on to the next clue. Next, 56 down. Right? Means ends. This is a fun one in that it involves taking the problem and splitting it up into tiny little pieces. It's also known as the Fermi method for Enrico Fermi. He was famous for taking big problems, taking little pieces of them, and just solving the little bitty pieces around the edges. And when he got into the middle was another itty bitty piece. He's famous also for when standing there in the blockhouse at the Trinity test, no one had set up the instrumentation so that the people in the blockhouse could see what was going on. So he took a piece of paper, ripped it up into little bitty pieces, and when the blast hit, he let them go and watched how far they spread out on the floor. And he estimated the yield of the blast to within 10%. Typical of Enrico Fermi. Take the problem, split it up into little pieces, and solve the little pieces. Simplify. Again, it's very similar to this. Notice that this is the case of solve the big stuff first, rather than the little stuff, and the little stuff will take care of itself. So again, 2 ways of just dividing up the problem. Split halves. Again, another way of dividing the problem up. Plumbers use this a lot. Computer network engineers use this a lot. The damn thing won't work. What's the problem? Well, cut it in half. If the leak is still occurring here and not occurring here, there's the problem. To divide that in half. It's also called the Christmas tree bulb solution. So when you have the string of lights, take them apart one at a time, find the bulb, now it works. Work backwards. Oh yeah, this works really well. Now, they don't have this much anymore, but they used to have the Amaze in the Sunday comics, especially for kids. And the first time you tried it, sure enough, you started out in the beginning. And you, how many times did it take you to go to the end and work back to the beginning? 2? 3? I had a similar thing happen in my organic chemistry classes in college. Our professor would say, given what was it? Fire, air, earth, and water. Make this compound. And he'd had this big monstrous thing on the board. Well, what did you do? You worked backwards. You looked at this big monstrous thing and you said, I know how to make that piece. That's a Grignard reaction. Okay, so then you go back from the Grignard reaction. And this is chlorine. I can take methylene chloride and pop that in there and do that. And gradually you work back down to the point where you had a natural product of the earth. You could have methane or ethane or acetylene or any of the other things. And so you started from fire, air, earth, and water to build this really complex thing. Working backwards is a fun game. If you know the end solution, you can generally work backwards to where you are. Generalize, specialize. This is another chance to use the tree diagrams. This is all this is making up a big tree situation and working your way back through that. Rules. Very often we don't read the rules. No, really? How many of you have been in a college class or any other class and they hand you a test? And the first thing it says is read the instructions. and there'll be someone standing up there going, "Hello!" And then there'll be another person walking around the room, and then there'll be a person waving a piece of paper, and what's the very last thing on the rules? Fill in your name and hand in the piece of paper. So you've done these 20 stupid things, and all you had to do was write your name and hand in the piece of paper, because you didn't read the rules. Hints. Again, very similar. Rules, hints. Often hints are located in the way the problem is stated. So this goes back to our original thesis where we say, write the problem down. When you write the problem down, perhaps you give yourself the clue as to how to solve it. If someone else has given it to you, perhaps you can restate it. Brainstorm. A tedious process. At the very best, it's a tedious process. If the thing has never been done before, if you can't find anything. There are several examples of this. When I was doing my thesis, my dissertation, I was involved with the California Critical Thinking Skills Test, which had been developed in the early 70s using a brainstorming method. It actually gathered 25 of the leading experts in the field of thinking critically and gone through the entire process of how would we test people, how would we figure out if they're thinking critically, and worked our way back through it to develop this entire process. Then it was tested over the many years and found out, hey, guess what, it works. And that's, again, was the major test that I used. So brainstorming works, but it's a difficult process to do, and to do it well. You can do it with a smaller group of people. The problems become that the brainstorming session is sort of free thinking, and all thoughts are created equal, even though they're not all equal, but you can't get rid of them at first. So it's a difficult thing, but it's doable. Restate the problem. Again, a really good way of doing it. Turn the problem backwards. Invert your subject and your object. See what that does. It changes your perspective. Look at it from a different angle. And sometimes it works. Metaphors and analogies. What's it like? What's it not like? We all know the problem with analogies. You can have an analogy that sounds really good, and the analogy works. It's just that it's not completely the same thing as the problem you're solving. So although you solve the analogy, your problem still is unsolved. So, a basic strategy says, here's what we do. If it's ill-defined, restate it. If it's easy, trial and error might work. If it's complicated, simplify it. Using means, ends, or generalization or specialization. Use one of these techniques to get rid of stuff. If the goal is easily defined, work backwards. Seek additional information. If orderly, try a matrix, or split paths, or seeking rules. If it's new, brainstorm it. Use analogies and metaphors, and seek advice from experts. Yeah, find people who know more than you do. That's sort of easy, especially in this area where we have such a plethora of higher-end universities and research associations. Sooner or later, you could get to the point of bah humbug. It's not working, I can't solve it. Well, maybe it's not soluble. Okay, treat it as a decision. You're going to have to do something, so you want to do the best thing that you can do. And here's, again, a basic framework. And you start out by identifying, recognizing, and framing the decision. Writing it down, getting the words right, looking at it, tearing it apart. Generate alternatives. This is huge. And evaluate the alternatives. Now, this is a do loop. You go around this do loop as many times as is necessary to get to generate your alternatives and to evaluate alternatives. When you've sort of exhausted yourself, break out of the do loop and seek alternatives and action. What do you actually do with this stuff? Act and evaluate. Let's see how this works. Once again, prepare a worksheet. Write it down. Frame the decision. What is the actual decision that you're making? List the alternatives. Generate, weigh, calculate, resolve. We've already got a whole lot of basic strategies. You will find that matrices are very, very, very helpful in framing a decision. They're good because they're nice and ordered, and you can always add other stuff in. You can always add categories. And you can establish a numerical system that says, this is good, this is bad, this is awful. And evaluate it based on a numerical system. Tree diagrams, again, can also be quite helpful. You list your considerations. What things are important? What things are not important? Be careful not to delude yourself. We're trying to make a rational decision, trying not to be emotional about it. Now, is there times to be emotional? Oh, sure. But put that as a category, not as a factual point. Look for disconfirming evidence. It's so easy in this process to get yourself going in a single direction, putting the blinders on, and not looking out at anything else. Seek out that disconfirming evidence. This is sort of where we started, right? When we began number 1. Generate alternatives. The more alternatives you have, the better. Again, seek that disconfirming evidence. And the matrices, again, are going to supply excellent, excellent ways of doing things. Weigh the considerations. This is where your rational numbering system comes into play. You can do it in several ways. I like a numerical system which is a 7-point system. 0 is neutral. So it's neutral, good, better, best, bad, worse, worst. So I have both positive and negative in my scalar, and I can work extremely well that way. Other people do 0 to 5. Again, perfectly good way, but it has to work all the time the same way.
Are you talking about using negatives too? -5 and -7?
I do.
Yeah.
But unless you know what you're doing, adding up bunches of positives and negatives can be interesting. So you've got to be careful with your signs. What happens when you subtract a negative? Yeah, so it can be fun. That's why the 0 to 5 is simpler. And you've got to pay attention the other way around. Again, I suggest don't be emotional unless this is an emotional decision. Calculate, calculate, calculate each decision using your numbers. Resolve any dilemmas. This is where your disconfirming evidence is going to come into play a lot. You think it's true, and then you go, oh, wait a minute. Oh, no, that isn't right. If it's a matrix, especially if it's on a computer, you can add and subtract. You can blow off lines. You can add new lines in. It's really easy. Congratulations, you've made a decision. Do it. Is there a better alternative out there? Maybe. But let's remember, the decision not to make a decision is a decision. If you got to do it, do it. And if it works out well, you go, hey. And if it doesn't, you go, well, I did the best I could. Later, of course, you're going to look back and evaluate your decision-making skills. Now, we've got an awful lot of words here. Let's take an example of some things. Here's a simple one. A frog fell into a well. And we're going to put some time limits on him. Every hour he jumps up 2 feet, falls back 1. How long will it take him to get out of the well? Well, if you do simple math, you're going to come up with a number like 5. Let's not do simple math. Let's do a diagram. 1, 2, 3, 4. He's not going to fall back 2 feet here because he's out of the well. Oh yeah. So once again, the diagram has done a wonderful job. Classic. Right? Absolute classic. 3 orcs and 3 hobbits arrive at a river. There's a boat, can hold 2 of them. The problem is, of course, if the orcs outnumber the hobbits, the orcs have a wonderful feed. It's just delicious. They have a spit perfectly made, just the right size for hobbit, and they're delicious this time of year. So you've got to get them across the river. Can you do it mentally? I can't. So I draw a picture. So I've got the near side of the river, I've got the far side of the river, and I've got the river. So I'm going to think about this, and I'm going to think about it in terms of my basic tree diagram. There are 3 possibilities, right? 1, I can send 2 orcs over. 2, I can send 2 hobbits over. 3, I can send 1 of each. What will be the consequences? Well, if I send over 2 orcs, I'll have 3 hobbits here, 1 orc, 2 no-eaten hobbits. That could work. I could send over 1 of each. No eaten hobbits. I could send over 2 hobbits. 1 eaten hobbit. So that's one choice. It's automatically eliminated. I'm going to choose to put 2 orcs in a boat. And get them across there. All right. Now, somehow or other the boat's got to come back, so that means 1 orc has to return. I get it back here, and I still have hobbits outnumbering orcs. Good. No supper yet. What now? Again, I have exactly the same 3 choices. I can send 2 orcs over, I can send 2 hobbits over, I can send over 1 of each. So what would happen? What are the consequences? If I send 2 hobbits over, whoops, I leave 2 orcs and a hobbit. Well, I leave 2 very satisfied orcs. If I send over 2 orcs, well, that would work. If I send over a hobbit and an orc, when I get there, there will be 2 orcs and 1 hobbit. Again, very happy orcs. So I only have one choice. I'm restricted. I can send over 2 orcs, making 3 on that side, and 1 comes back. So far, the hobbits are winning. Yay, hobbits! Well, now my choices are sort of limited, aren't they? If I try to send 1 orc and 1 hobbit over, I will end up with 3 orcs and 1 lovely meal. So that won't work. So I have to send 2 hobbits. Well, that works. Uh-oh, here I am, I'm in trouble. Who do I send back? Can I send back 2 orcs? No, that's not going to work. Can I send back 2 hobbits? Well, that's just where I was. So my only other choice is 1 of each. So far we have, nobody's had breakfast yet. All right, let's try this again. Who can I send over now? Well, what happens if I send over 2 hobbits? Aha! Now I send the orc back to pick up his buddies. And we've done it. Yay! Could we have done this with just plain mental gymnastics? No. It's just too many decisions, too many thinking. It just doesn't work out well. But the moment you put it down on a piece of paper, it works out fine. Paper and pencil works. A more interesting and difficult one. You worked for this company for 14 years. You got a history with them. They paid for your education. They promoted you twice. You received good raises. You love your job, your co-workers, your company. wow, everything is cool, and now the company's going to go away. It's moving from the big city, where you've been living, to the suburbs of the city in a neighboring state. You're going to go from city to burbs, and from one state to another. Do you go? Obviously, this is not a solution. We don't have a single yes, no. There's a lot of choices in here, a lot of things we have to think about. I chose this specifically because it's complex enough for us to realize, no, there's no good solution. There's a decision that needs to be made. So what do? Again, let's go through our process. We define the dilemma. Is this a problem or a decision? Yeah, it's a decision, so we're going to frame it. We're going to generate alternatives, list considerations, weigh them, calculate, and resolve. Break the dilemma into smaller pieces, resolve each one, and combine. So again, we're using our skills here. We're breaking it up into small pieces and resolving each. So here's one instance. I'm going to say I'm setting up this thing called me and my company, me and my home, my present expenses, me and my new home, my new expenses, other basic categories. Within the category, me and the company, do I like it? Education, promotions, pay, people, company functions, all that other kind of stuff. So I'm breaking it down into finite little, easy to digest molecules. Again, me and my present home. I look at this and do I like it? How big is it? My rent or mortgage? Utilities, convenience, neighborhoods, friends. And of course, when you're in the city, another thing you think about is transportation costs. Very often in the city, you don't need a car. Out here in the burbs, if you don't have a car, you don't go anywhere. You can get out to the front door and go back in. So again, we're going to break this down into all of these different components, and we're going to put them into a matrix. And here's a part of that matrix. Here's my company. Do I like it? Yeah, 5 points there. Education. Look, they've done good things for me. They got me my MBA. That's a big expense on their part. Promotions. Yeah, I've done really well there. I'm a supervisor. Yeah, I've been here 14 years, and I can't complain. My pay is good. My position's good. They pay for my education. I like this company. And so you go through all of these things one at a time, building up a series of considerations, and notice the numerical values. As a for instance, at the end of all of this, you'd say, I like my company and I want to stay, but I'm not sure if I can find similar employment. My present living and commuting costs are low. Future living and commuting costs are going to be high. We know that. You're in the burbs. Your chances of getting an apartment are different than they are in the city. The chances of having public services. And of course, you have your family, friends, and the social activities that you've had for the last 14, 15 years. And they're all going to be jeopardized. You're going to be out of state. So, what's your preliminary decision? You say, I like the company, the job, the people. I would prefer to stay. But it's going to cost too much. Rent, car, insurance, commuting, jeopardize all the friends I've made, all my family, everything else. I'm going to stay where I'm at and find a new job. And then you look at this and you go, and find a new job. Disconfirming evidence. Is it really that easy to find a new job? Maybe I did overlook something. I'm going to rethink. So I use my old friend, the tree diagram. Is it 100% that I'm going to keep my old job? 100%. Yeah, I'm going to have to find a new home. True. I'll find new friends and activities, and again, I'm going to have a car whether I want it or not. So I can still visit, go back. What about the new job? Well, looking through the papers, looking through the warrant, looking through everything else, it's problematic if I'm going to find a new job. It's the same or better. If I do, I'll be able to keep my old homes, my old friends, and activities. But what happens if I can't? It'll be worse. I could actually lose my home. And this thing called unemployment is not a good idea. And yeah, based upon this, I got 100% of the old job and 30% the new job, 67% failure. Based upon this reevaluation, I'm going to go and get this. I'm going to stick with my old company. Yeah, and this again, taking that disconfirming evidence into account, changes the entire thing. So what did I do? I framed the decision by cutting it up into small pieces, evaluating them separately. I generated alternatives within the framework, listed considerations, weighed them, calculated, resolved. So listed them, weighed the considerations, used the matrix to calculate the decision. I reevaluated. I hadn't calculated the odds of getting a new job. Discovering the dilemma, I used a tree diagram, our good old friend, the tree diagram. I considered the disconfirming probability of getting a worse job or even none at all. So I resolved my dilemma. I'm going to keep my great job. I'm going to eat the expenses. People live in the suburbs. They've been doing it for a long time. It's a successful way of life. I'll make new friends. And I'll keep my newly acquired car to go visit my old friends. I made a decision. So if we look at them, problems and decisions, at least when you start out looking at them, they look the same. You're not sure whether you're going to be able to solve this or not. And so you take a standard procedure and you go through that procedure one piece at a time, and always looking for the problem that you missed something. Looking for that disconfirming evidence. Oh, before I end my discussion, I have to do science, right? I have to do science. This is Science Sunday, after all. I don't know if you saw this, but this is the four-eyed lizard that walked the earth 49 million years ago. If you lived in what is now Wyoming 49 million years ago, you would have spotted a four-eyed lizard, the one and only known examples of such a creature among jawed vertebrates. Cool, huh? Want to see? Want to see a lizard with four eyes?
Please.
You knew it was coming, right? Okay. So, thank you. Oh, hi.
An observation, not a question. Sometimes you just have an idea of what the correct answer is to a problem. And you need to convince yourself that that is in fact the case. But if you assume that it's what it looks like is the truth, sometimes that makes it easier to figure out whether in fact is the truth. I remember a high school math teacher saying, if two things look equal, they probably are. Now you've got to figure out why. That sort of thing.
Yes, that's true. Very often, especially as we get older, we've been there, done that, we've seen it. And you look at something and you go, that's how you do it. There's an area called expertise, and those people who study expertise will look at this and say, yeah. They did experiments, for instance, with fire chiefs. And there'd be a fire, and they would follow the fire trucks to it, and the chief would go, let's do this, 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 and this. Why did they choose to do those things in that order? Been there, done that. Why do chess players just say boom, 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 and they're off running it? Expertise. We build these circuits in, and in our field of expertise, we're very, very good. And an amateur would go, how would you do that? And if you think about it, You're not 100% sure. It's become so innate. Ted Williams was asked how he hit the baseball, and he said, with the bat. And, you know, you look at this guy, the last man to hit 400. And how did he do it? Very well. So, yes, there is this area of expertise, but this is also the time to practice seeking disconfirming evidence. It is really, really, really easy for all of us to convince ourselves that we're right. I know personally, I'm right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then someone comes along and goes, oh, and points to this little measly thing called a fact. And you go, and you take the pin and you burst your bubble. Yeah. So yes, it's true. Very often we do know the answer. We have to convince ourselves, but we have to be very careful to look for that disconfirming evidence, that we're not deluding ourselves into doing something which, you know, how many times can you make the same mistake in a row? A lot. Girlfriends of mine always talk about, I just can't meet the right man because, and you say, well, you dated 6 guys in a row and they're all the same. She said, well, that's the kinds of guys I like. She said, no, they're not. Really? So, yeah.
Well, along those lines, I'm thinking about reports I've seen about like specialty doctors, like OBGYNs who do C-sections at a certain rate. And then you find, well, in a certain region, they all do C-sections at a certain rate. And you think, why do they do that? Well, they've always done it. They make more money at it. It's what they've become expert at, right?
If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah, that's the problem that you can run into with this whole idea of expertise. Again, as you said, if your only tool is a hammer, everything's a nail.
If I have a stomachache, I don't want a C-section.
Yeah, well, one of the things about OBGYNs is they tend to look for girls-type people rather than boy-type people. So there's that instant qualification problem. Disconfirming evidence, you see.
Sounds sexist.
Just to confirm what you say about practice being perfect, I find that sleeping on a decision is the best way for me to proceed. I find that a lot of times I do my best thinking in the middle of the night.
Yes, again, we have the science. It's something we all know is true. And again, we got the science. Of course, when you sleep, there's a huge amount of brain reordering going on. And again, new science, something that mothers have been telling us since, Adam and Eve type things. Yeah, it's true. Your mind is going to be working on things. It's going to be getting rid of stuff that is no good and assimilating stuff that is good and trying to put it in with everything else. And of course, that process is wonderful for putting together problems and resolving them. Again, we do have to be cautious about our own innate selves. We're really good at delusion. And we have to be careful of seeking out that disconfirming evidence. Otherwise, yeah, sleeping on it is a very good tactic. Scott?
2 things. First, one of the things that often comes up when I'm talking to people about making decisions or deciding what's real or true is an amazing little nugget of knowledge I came across a few years ago, and that is thinking that you're correct or feeling correct about something is an intimate emotion in our brains. And even this is one of the reasons why people argue over silly things, because being right is so tied into our sense of satisfaction, our sense of social position, our sense of self-confidence. Being right is an emotion, and it's really hard. You have to practice discipline to overcome that, to say, oh, okay, well, I guess I was mistaken about that. How many times do we fail to recognize that we've made an error because our egos are in the way? And pushing that little piece out of the way can be really important and really challenging. I encourage everyone to think about that when you get into a discussion with somebody. If you think you may be wrong, just say, oh, well, maybe you're right. I need to research that a little more. Right? You don't always have to fight over, especially little things. Second point is, do you know what you call a fish with no eyes?
What do you call a fish with no eyes?
A fish.
A fish. Well, that's because the lizard stole them all. Russ?
Sometimes when trying to find a solution to a problem, I like to pull myself out of the equation because I will come up with really good solutions for other people as compared to myself. Like if somebody comes to me and says, I've had a pain in my side for a week, I'll say, go see a doctor. But if I have a pain in my side for a week, I'm sure it just needs more time to get better.
Yeah, again, we have the problem that both of you essentially pointing out the same thing. We're really good at deluding ourselves. Deluding ourselves in the amount of knowledge or skills we have, deluding ourselves in the state of our health, our skill levels. Again, in earlier examples here, we asked people about their skill levels in comparison with their test levels. And we found that everyone thought themselves to be in the 70th percentile. When in fact, it fit the standard curve. The people who really didn't know anything and were in fact down at the 10 percentile, the 5 percentile, were sure that they were in the 70th percentile. Now, of course, the people that were in the 70th percentile, they thought they were in the 70th percentile too. Oddly enough, the people who were in the 90th percentile thought they were in the 70th percentile. So the 70th percentile is really a common place for everyone to exist. Yeah, we're ego-driven. And this is the problem that we have to face. We are emotional beings with an overlay, just this really skinny overlay of thought and knowledge and decision-making and the application of the frontal lobes. It's far easier not to use them. They're new, they're slow, they're hard to work. So we do all the other parts and pieces. And emotions are easy. Oh, they're right up top. Just relax and there they are. Hi.
Yeah, I've heard that, on that point, I've heard that 80% of the drivers believe they are above average.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Everyone is a superior driver. And it's all those idiots out there. If they just get off the road, I'd be fine. And, no.
What do you do with information overload making a decision?
Sometimes I wonder about information overload. Is it actually information? Especially people who will get a lot of information from the internet. How much of that is valid? How do you test the validity? I've never run into the problem of information overload personally, although I know other people who have. And I tend to find myself looking in journals or online situations where I can identify the person. And I'll use my Wikipedia to find out more about that person and find out their particular bent, their particular point of view. And if I find out if it's a legitimate expert in that field, I'm just going to sit down and absorb as much as I can. If I find it's a political columnist or something like that, I'm just going to blow them off. And at first, you can't tell the difference. So I do wonder about the idea of information overload in this particular era of our world. How much of it is really information, and do we discriminate? Do we use our ability to analyze to determine whether or not the information is valid, whether it's truthful, whether it has any merit, or is this just some troll out there, like the Russian troll that takes things and just reiterates them? I look, for instance, at this person on, Fox News, who was attacking the students who managed to survive the massacre down in Florida. And I wonder, what is the matter with this person? But then again, this is a person on television with a big audience. She's obviously lost some of her audience and some of her sponsors, but that hasn't stopped her. And I wonder what's going on. The validity, when I look at the validity of this particular person's analysis, I find it sorely lacking. When I look at the students who survived this horrible thing and wish not to do it again, I find their point of view much more valid. Does that help? I don't know.
Not a lot, but
Jamie?
I just want to make one of the reasons I brought up, I did a brilliant study the other day or something, I assume it's partially correct. People with low information are the people most adamant about their decision. But people
You
who
notice
have
that.
lots of information, they make a decision, but they're still open to change.
Yes, the more ignorant you are, the more closely you hold your opinion.
Right.
As you become more and more educated, you realize you don't know anything. And everything that you have is built on mush. And anyone's going to come along anytime and sort of give you a little push, and your entire equilibrium is going to go out. And the world is going to change. And you go, oh, Gesundheit. And we find that, just look at it in our own lives. If we start out in World War II, we had propeller-driven aircraft, and then a few years later, we're putting men on the moon. The world changed. We went from, oh, you have a heart condition, you're going to die, to, oh, let's replace your heart. What? The world goes on, and we have to be aware of it. And people who hold a stagnant position are the ones that are difficult, are on great difficulty. And if they're completely ignorant, as so many people are with these really strong opinions, I don't know how to do anything with them because they don't have the basis of knowledge to make a decision. They're strictly operating on emotions. And we know, if it's an emotional... Yeah. Mm-hmm. Jamie?
Yeah, in support of that, I can't tell you what the study is, but there have been studies done to show how people gravitate toward their sources of data and information. And they tend to select out things which reaffirm what they already believe. So that even if someone with a very firm set of beliefs, but no factual support for it, were to go look for information, they would tend to gravitate toward the resources that support their pre-existing position. So
Absolutely.
It's a very, very difficult situation to try and break into and to try and get people to think about what it is that they know.
Yes, and I've held myself up as an example here. As I said a couple of weeks ago, months ago, whatever, I try to read Charles Krauthammer. I get 2 paragraphs in and I'm steaming. Because I'm such a calm person. You know that. And trying to listen to Sean Hannity is utterly beyond me. I can't do it.
I've read Ann Coulter books and Bill O'Reilly books.
Yep. And I can do it more easily in the form of a book. Because I don't have to see their faces. I can disassociate the words from the person and look at the logic that they're trying to convince me and say, this does not fit with the facts as I know them. Which gives me an opportunity. I can now go back into the literature and look things up. And that's one of the great parts about the internet. I can look up the Washington Post, I can look up the New York Times, I can look up the Chicago Tribune, I can look up factual information from Nature, from Science, National Geographic. I can go to all of these places and find sources of information and go, this is what we discovered, this is what you said, they are different. Or they are the same, therefore this is acceptable. And I can go through that. And I find that going through that process with many of the so-called pundits, they don't have the facts to begin with. They're starting out from a prejudice point of view. They continue to spout emotions rather than facts, and they don't persuade me. But people, again, as we pointed out, people who start out from a position of ignorance are going to maintain that, oh, yes, that's true, yes. and someone supporting me. There's this fellow, and I don't remember his name, but he's an infamous radio commentator. And the other day he was railing against the bombing of Syria and how Trump had thrown away all of the conservative credits that he had been building up, and they shouldn't be doing this. And he was actually in tears, enraged, screaming into the microphone. And I don't understand why. What was he doing? This was strictly an emotional appeal, which had, where were the facts? Where was the data? Where was the reasoned analysis saying, this occurred and this occurred, and here's the order in which things occur, and here are the options that they had, and here's the options we had, and going through a process, as we did here, of, do I want to go through a job?
Boring, not entertaining.
Boring, not entertaining, difficult. You have to go in there and find disconfirming evidence. You have to question yourself and your motives. And after a while, you probably come to a decision you don't like, so you discard it completely. Because, again, it did not fit with your preconceived notions. Hi.
Hi. Your diagram earlier about the suicide rate, there was the 2% and then the 8 or 8%. And then there was the test the 2% went through and it had like 1.64 or something like that. Could you talk at all about that test? I'm just curious.
No, I don't know anything about the test. I know the test is valid. I went back into the literature and made sure that it actually existed. It does. And I don't know enough about the psychology that she was using, or the test that I did not do the test. But again, it is in the literature.
So what would one search for if one wanted to look it up?
Oh, suicide prevention?
Okay.
Assessment test, probably.
I'm sure there's got to be someone in this group who does something along that line, as well as yourself, that would be helpful. Because in this group there's an awful lot of really highly skilled people.
Going back to when you were talking about metaphors, at Synaptics, when we were working with business types on product service innovations, we would often try to get them to be sort of feeling childish and playful. And using metaphors was a good way to do that. And the aspect of brainstorming where you suspend judgment and just fool around with ideas. I think that sometimes you can forget your ego in your playfulness.
Yeah.
And it's a good way to generate some crazy alternatives that then need to be forced down into reality.
Indeed. If we can get to our child side, not childish, but childlike side, it's interesting how we would view the world. How does a 3-year-old really view the world? Very differently from a person who's added 70 years onto that. So, can you go back and look at it? Yeah, but it's really hard.
Our president does it all the time.
I'm pretty good at it, actually. When I grow up, Hi, way back there.
Do you have an outline available, or would you refer us to a place where you can...
Scott, I'm wondering, can we do something about putting the
Yes.
PowerPoints onto the thing? I know we've got
the meetup site has a place where we can upload messages and/or files. If you go to the meetup site, you'll see a menu that you always ignore across the top, and one of those menus takes you to a discussion forum. I think there may be another section for files, but if not, we'll figure out something.
Because we've got, obviously we've got the videos on YouTube.
Already?
And so if you go to the Humanists of West Suburban Chicagoland YouTube site, we'll have all these videos, all 6 of them up, plus of course all of Scott's. He's got 2 years of marvelous videos. and we'll try to do something with the PDFs, because there's just a lot of information there that it's hard to go through the video and retain the information. It's much easier if you put it in your hot little hand.
Maybe you should write a book too.
Pardon me?
Maybe you should write a book too.
Oh. I'm into book 2 of fantasy, so Terra Infirma.
Very cute.
Come to a story.
Oh, it's sci-fi, and I completed the first book. I submitted stuff to publishers, to agents and stuff. I'm halfway through the second book of 5, and my co-author died. And she was the one with all the ideas. I did English. She did ideas. So that's what I need to do. Write another book. Oh, why?
Well, this goes without saying, I'm sure, to everybody here. Of course, you're speaking to probably a very highly educated audience.
Oh, yes.
And I come from the teaching background, and I wonder if you've had any interaction with the public school systems. As you know, I'm sure, the dearth of critical thinking skills in K through 12 is probably some of the root cause as to why conservative commentators on radio have audiences with emotional responses, et cetera, et cetera. So I look at it from an educational point of view. We have such a low level of critical thinkers in this country.
I couldn't agree with you more. The level of critical thinking in this country is abysmal. It starts in the school systems. There is no course in any elementary, middle, or high school that teaches thinking critically. None. 0 in the entire. In the college system, the only place you will find it is in the schools of philosophy. And then there's strictly 1 or at most 2 courses in philosophy. You will find none in education. 0. I have railed against this. I have fought against it. I have done everything that I, as a single person, can do, and I have been told.
Joanne, have you seen the news this week about what Elmhurst Public Schools are doing? They are completely restructuring their curriculum to include critical thinking.
Elmhurst is going to include critical thinking.
Critical thinking and creativity as part of their absolute, total, overriding curriculum design. I am so excited about what they're doing.
Yeah, I've looked for
I'm trying to get in touch with them.
at the core program as it's been published, and that has some excellent critical thinking. It's not only delineated, but then utilized throughout the course.
Are you talking about Common Core?
Common Core.
Standard?
Yeah.
I think that's who they're referring to.
One of the problems that we have in thinking critically is there's 2 parts to it. The first is a formal education in how to do it. Recognizing it when it occurs, recognizing it when it doesn't occur, recognizing how to go through the process of developing an argument, solving problems, thinking about decisions, being creative, disconfirming evidence, the problem with our own senses. And all of these things go together into that milieu, which we call thinking critically. You have to recognize that its existence. Then, when it's applied in math, in science, in English, in history, you go, aha, I can see how this is working. I can see how decisions are being made, and were they valid decisions? Were they wise decisions? What was the consequences thereof? And going back through it, it becomes a normal process for you to look at it from that perspective. Without it, we end up in exactly the situation now where Ann Coulter is the media magnet. Hannity is the person to whom we turn for all of our knowledge of the day's events. Sorry, but no, it's not true.
A lot of times, though, Joanne, children learn this at their mother's knee or at the dinner table, that parents can convey this to their children simply through ordinary day-to-day conversation.
Yes, we are children of our parents.
Right.
Where does our religious background come from? You were born a Roman Catholic. You were born a Muslim. You were born a Baptist. Why? Because your parents told you were. And they brought you to, and then here is your entire environment. Yeah. And how do you get into the critical thinking aspect of it? Again, the other day, I came up in the elevator, and there was a gal with her 2 children, and she said, well, I have to get them to class. And this was after school. I'm going, what class are they going to? And they said, they're going to go study the Quran. You know how hard it is to bite your tongue?
Yes.
You want to say something.
Here on the Sunday, the 22nd at 3 p.m., there's going to be a Bible study starting with Genesis. I plan on attending.
Because as anyone who has read it, it's one of the great fairy tales. It's hilarious how they screwed things up. And one of the things I love to do, and I'm sorry, I bait. I have people say, is this God's truth? Oh yes. And this is the entirety. This is the whole story. This is everything, right? So this is God's whole truth. Yeah. And are there any lies in there? Is anything missing? So it's nothing but the truth. So this is God's truth, God's whole truth, and nothing but God's truth. So it's testimony, right? And then you start. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God walked upon the face of the waters. And the earth was without form and void. First sentence. Water came before the universe. Where does the oxygen come from? I know where the hydrogen comes from. Where does the oxygen come from? I think we need stars to make oxygen. And then, of course, they do their thing and blow up and do stuff like that. And you just wander your way through it. And everything is backwards or missing. And if you go through it this way, it really, really angers people. Really angers them. And then, of course, they're toting their AR-15 at that point, so maybe that's not a good idea. Thank you.